My sister described him in one word before I met him, and that word turned out to be the only thing she got wrong. She said he's boring. Sweet, but boring. Don't expect fireworks. I just think you'd be good for each other because neither of you tries too hard. I want to say up front that my sister meant this as a compliment, in the strange way that sisters sometimes compliment you by lowering your expectations so far that anything above ground level feels like a miracle. My name is Hannah, I'm 28, and at the time all of this started, I was working at a veterinary clinic in Bend, Oregon, as a vet tech, which meant my days were full of anxious dogs, calm cats who were somehow always the ones who bit you, and a level of dog hair on my clothes that no amount of washing ever fully addressed. I loved the job. I had wanted to work with animals since I was young enough that wanting to work with animals mostly meant bringing home injured birds and assuming my mother would fix them, which she usually did, because my mother is the kind of person who fixes things. I was single. I had been single for about 2 years, since a relationship with a man named Brett ended in the unglamorous way that relationships end when one person has quietly checked out months before the other person notices. Brett hadn't been cruel. He'd just been gone, in all the ways that matter, long before he physically left, and by the time I understood that, I was more relieved than sad, which had taken me a while to forgive myself for. After Brett, I hadn't dated much. Not because I was heartbroken. I wasn't, not really, but because I had gotten comfortable in a life that was mine. My apartment, my dog Biscuit, a rescue with 3 legs, and the personality of someone who has decided, against all odds, to be an optimist. My shifts at the clinic, Sunday dinners with my sister Claire and her husband. It was a small life, but it was solid, and after Brett, solid had felt like an accomplishment. I adopted Biscuit about 6 months after Brett moved out. She'd been at the shelter for nearly a year. Most people, the volunteers told me, took one look at the missing leg and moved on to the next kennel, as if a dog with 3 legs was somehow a dog with less to offer, rather than a dog who had simply adapted. She'd been hit by a car as a puppy, recovered, and spent the rest of her life moving through the world at a slight diagonal, completely undeterred by it. I used to sit with her in the shelter's visiting room and think about how she didn't seem to know anything was missing. She just got on with being a dog. I found that strangely instructive in the months after Brett, when I was also trying to figure out how to get on with things, while privately cataloging everything that felt like it was missing. By the time Claire started her campaign to set me up, Biscuit and I had a rhythm. Morning walks before my shift, evening walks after, weekends doing very little, which suited us both. I told Claire more than once that I wasn't lonely. This was mostly true. It just wasn't the whole truth. And Claire, Beezing my sister, knew the difference even when I didn't say it out loud. Claire had been trying to set me up for about a year. I had declined every time, gently at first and then less gently, until she stopped asking directly and started doing the thing, where she'd mention someone's name in conversation, and then watch my face very carefully to see if I reacted. The man's name was Daniel. Claire knew him through her husband. They'd gone to college together, lost touch, reconnected a few years back. Daniel had moved to Bend about 8 months earlier for work. Claire described him as quiet, easy to be around, divorced, no kids, worked in some kind of engineering job she didn't fully understand and didn't pretend to. He's boring, she said again. The second time she brought him up. But good boring. Steady boring. I think you'd like steady right now. I asked her what right now meant. She said, after Brett, I think steady might actually be what you need, even if it doesn't sound exciting. I agreed to meet him, mostly because Claire had been patient for a year, and patience like that deserves something in return, even if the something is just one dinner you can complain about afterward. We met at a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and candles in old wine bottles, which Claire had picked because she said it was low pressure, and the kind of place where, if it went badly, at least the bread was good. I got there first. I always get places first. It's a habit from years of being the responsible older sibling, the one who shows up on time, so other people don't have to feel bad about being late. I sat at a small table near the window and ordered a glass of wine, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that I was nervous, which annoyed me because Claire's whole pitch had been that this was low stakes. Daniel arrived 7 minutes later. I recognized him from the photo Claire had shown me. Dark hair, tall, the kind of face that looks slightly different in person than in photos. Because photos don't capture how someone holds themselves. He looked, if I'm honest, exactly as advertised. Pleasant. Unremarkable in the specific way that boring had primed me to expect. Dressed simply, nothing performative about it. He was carrying something. A small paper bag, the kind you get from a hardware store or a pharmacy, slightly crumpled at the top like it had been in his car for a bit. He sat down, apologized for being a few minutes late. Traffic on the bridge, he said, which in Bend means approximately 4 extra cars. And then, before anything else, before even properly introducing himself beyond a handshake, he set the paper bag on the table between us. He said, sounds strange, and I thought about not doing it, but I decided strange was probably better than not doing it at all. I looked at the bag. I looked at him. He said, Claire mentioned you work at a vet clinic, and that you have a 3-legged dog. I have a dog too. Well, my parents do. I just visit her a lot, and she's old and has some mobility stuff. And I was at the pet store yesterday for her, and I saw this, and I thought of your dog, even though I've never met your dog, which I realize is a strange thing to base a decision on. He pushed the bag toward me. I opened it. Inside was a soft dog bed, the kind with raised foam edges for support, sized for a smaller dog. There was also a small toy, a stuffed fox, slightly absurd looking. The kind of toy that exists purely because someone in a factory somewhere has decided dogs need stuffed foxes. I sat there holding a dog bed on a first date and didn't know what to say for a second. He said, I should clarify, I'm not saying your dog needs a new bed. I don't actually know what your dog has. I just saw it and thought, well, if nothing else, dogs like beds, so it's not really a loss either way. I started laughing, not politely, actually laughing. The kind that surprises you because it arrives before you've decided to allow it. I said, you brought my dog a gift to a blind date. He said, when you say it like that, it sounds worse than it felt in the pet store. I said, no, I don't think anyone has ever done anything like this. My sister told me you were boring. He nodded slowly, like this was information he'd already had and had made peace with. He said, I am boring. I think bringing a dog bed to a date you've never been on, for a dog you've never met, might actually be one of the more interesting things I've done recently, which says more about my recent life than about tonight. I asked what his recent life had been like. He told me, over the course of that dinner, about his divorce. Not in a heavy way, not dragging me into something too soon, just factually. He'd been married for 6 years. His ex-wife had wanted to move to Portland for a job opportunity that was, by every reasonable measure, a good opportunity. He hadn't wanted to go. They'd tried the long-distance thing for almost a year, before they both admitted it wasn't working, not because either of them had done anything wrong, but because they'd wanted different things, and had spent a long time pretending that wasn't true. He said, we're still friendly, we talk sometimes. It wasn't a bad marriage. It was just a marriage between 2 people who were each waiting for the other one to want what they wanted, and neither of us ever did. I told him a little about Brett. Not the whole thing, just the shape of it, the slow checking out, the eventual relief. He listened. He didn't try to relate it back to his own situation, or compare notes in the way some people do on first dates, where every story you tell becomes a launching pad for their own story. He just listened, and at the end he said, that sounds like it took a while to actually end, even after it was basically over. I said yes, exactly that. He said, I think those are sometimes harder than the dramatic ones, the ones that just sort of deflate. We talked for almost 3 hours. The restaurant staff started doing the thing where they hover near your table without quite asking you to leave, and we eventually took the hint and walked out into a cool evening, both of us a little surprised, I think, at how long we'd been there. He walked me to my car. He didn't try anything. No lean in, no charged moment, nothing that felt like it was performing romance. He just said it had been a really nice evening, and that he hoped the dog bed wasn't too weird, and that he'd like to do this again if I wanted to. I said yes. I drove home with a dog bed and a stuffed fox in my passenger seat and called Claire before I'd even parked. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Well?" I said, "He brought Biscuit a present." There was a pause. Then she said, "I'm sorry, he what?" I explained. Claire laughed so hard she had to put the phone down for a second. She said, "Okay, that's not boring." "That's the least boring thing I've ever heard. I take it back. I take back boring." Biscuit, for her part, regarded the dog bed with the deep suspicion that three-legged rescue dogs reserve for anything new, sniffed it for approximately 4 minutes, and then claimed it as her own so thoroughly that within a week it smelled exactly like her, and she would not allow it to be washed. Daniel and I saw each other again the following weekend, and the weekend after that. It became, without either of us declaring it officially, a thing that was happening. I learned more about him over those weeks. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm that did bridge inspections and retrofits, a job that involved a lot of very precise math and a lot of standing underneath large structures looking up at them with serious expressions, which he demonstrated for me once in a way that made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. He was, in most observable ways, exactly what Claire had described. Quiet, steady. He didn't fill silences with noise. He thought before he answered things, which sometimes meant conversations had pauses in them that would have felt awkward with someone else, but didn't with him. They just felt like he was actually considering what I'd said. One Saturday he took me to see one of his projects, a bridge retrofit out near the river, mostly finished, scaffolding still up on one side. He walked me underneath it and pointed out things I never would have noticed on my own. Where the old supports had been failing, how the new steel distributed weight differently, why a particular joint had taken him 3 weeks to get approved. He talked about it the way some people talk about things they love but have never been encouraged to call love, carefully, almost apologetically, like he was worried it was too technical to be interesting. It wasn't. I stood under that bridge for almost an hour, listening to him explain how it worked, and at some point I realized I wasn't just listening to be polite. I actually wanted to know. I asked questions. He answered all of them, clearly delighted that someone had asked. He said, "Sorry, I know this is probably boring." I said, "Claire warned me you were boring. She didn't mention you were going to make a bridge sound like the most interesting thing I've ever heard." He looked pleased in a way he tried to hide and didn't quite manage. But underneath the steadiness was a kind of attentiveness that I had never quite experienced before, not because anyone had been unkind to me, but because most people, I was realizing, operate on a kind of autopilot when it comes to noticing things about other people. Daniel didn't. He noticed that I always ordered the same coffee, but sometimes, on harder days, ordered it with an extra shot, and he started being able to tell which kind of day it was before I said anything. He noticed that Biscuit got anxious around loud noises, and started, without making any production of it, avoiding restaurants near construction sites or busy streets when we brought her along. He noticed that I deflected compliments by making jokes, and one evening, instead of letting me deflect, he just said, "You don't have to do that." I meant it. "You can just say thank you." I sat with that for a second. I said thank you. It felt strange, like trying on a piece of clothing that didn't quite fit yet but might, eventually. About 4 months in, I asked him about the dog bed. Not why he'd bought it. I understood that, mostly. But why he'd been willing to walk into a first date carrying something that's strange. Something that could have gone over so badly. He thought about it for a while before answering, which was very him. He said, "After the divorce, I spent a long time being very careful. Careful about what I said, careful about not seeming too eager, careful about doing things the normal way, whatever that meant. And I think being that careful made me smaller. I stopped doing things just because they seemed like a kind thing to do, because I was too busy calculating whether they'd make the right impression." He said, "When I saw that dog bed, my first thought was, that's a nice thing to do for a dog I'll never meet. And then my second thought was, that's probably a weird thing to bring on a date. And I almost talked myself out of it." He said, "But then I thought, If I talk myself out of small, kind things because I'm worried about how they look, what's the actual point of any of this? I'd rather be the person who brings the weird dog bed and finds out it's too much than be careful forever and never find out what's actually true about someone. I asked what he meant by what's actually true. He said, like, if you'd thought it was weird, if you'd been embarrassed by it, that would have told me something. And it would have been useful information, even if it meant the date didn't go well. But if it wasn't weird, if it was just a thing that made you laugh, that would tell me something too. About what you actually valued. About whether the small things mattered to you the way they mattered to me. He said, I wanted real information, not performance. I thought about Brett, about 2 years of performance disguised as a relationship, about how long it had taken me to even notice that's what it had been. I said the dog bed was real information. He said, I know. That's why I kept calling. A year after that first dinner, Daniel and I moved in together. His place, which had more space, and, crucially, a yard for Biscuit, who by then regarded him as a secondary owner, and occasionally a primary one, depending on who had treats. He proposed on an unremarkable Tuesday. We were in the kitchen. Biscuit was attempting, as she often did, to insert herself into whatever we were doing, which that evening meant lying directly on Daniel's feet while he tried to cook. He stepped carefully around her, the way he always did, and said, I have something for you, not dramatically. The same tone he'd used 18 months earlier when he'd pushed a paper bag across a restaurant table. He handed me a small box. He said, I thought about doing something bigger. A restaurant, a trip, something with more of a setup. But I kept thinking about the dog bed, and how the most real thing I ever did was the thing that had the least production behind it. So I figured, Kitchen Tuesday, dog on my feet. That's us. That's real. I said yes while still holding a wooden spoon, which became, predictably, the detail everyone wanted to know about afterward. We got married the following autumn, in a small ceremony at a property outside Bend, with mountains in the background and about 30 guests. Claire gave a toast that included, of course, the dog bed story, which by then had achieved a kind of legendary status in both our families. Retold so many times that Daniel had started preempting it by saying, before anyone asks, yes, I really did bring a dog bed to a blind date, and yes, it really did work. But what I think about most when I think about that first dinner isn't actually the dog bed itself, strange as it was. It's the fact that he almost didn't bring it. He told me that later, that he sat in his car outside the restaurant for a few minutes. Paper bag on the passenger seat, trying to decide whether to leave it there. He decided to bring it in anyway. Not because he was confident it would land well. He had no idea if it would. He brought it because he decided that being honestly, awkwardly himself was worth more than being carefully, safely expressive. My sister had called him boring. She wasn't wrong about the surface of him. Quiet, steady, unremarkable in the ways that get noticed first. But underneath that was someone who had decided, after a marriage that had quietly come apart from two people being too careful with each other, that he would rather risk being too much than spend his life being careful again. That's not boring. That's just quiet until you're paying attention. I've been paying attention for 3 years now. I plan to keep doing it for considerably longer than that. Claire still brings up the dog bed every chance she gets, usually at family dinners, usually right when Daniel has finally relaxed enough to think the topic might not come up that particular evening. He's stopped being embarrassed by it. If anything, I think he's quietly proud of it now. Proud of the version of himself who sat in a parking lot, deciding whether to risk looking strange, and chose strange. Last month, Biscuit turned 11. Her hips have started giving her more trouble, and Daniel spent a weekend researching ramps and orthopedic supports, with the same focused seriousness he brings to bridge inspections, cross-referencing reviews, measuring doorways, ultimately building something himself that worked better than anything he could have bought. I watched him from the kitchen window, out in the yard with a tape measure and a sheet of plywood, Biscuit supervising from her spot in the shade, and I thought about a paper bag on a restaurant table 3 years earlier, and a man who had decided that small, careful kindness The kind nobody asks you to perform, the kind that doesn't make a good story V unless you're the person it happened to, was worth more than looking impressive. And Biscuit's dog bed, fox and all, still smells like her and still hasn't been washed. And Daniel still pretends not to notice when I catch him checking on her before he checks on anything else when he gets home. Which, he always says, isn't true, except it always gently obviously is.